All right, good morning.
Good morning.
We are going to continue our studies in the prophecies of Malachi, and we're going to, I guess before we read, we're going to start into chapter 2. We're just kind of, high level, what we've been looking at is Malachi is broken up into these different discourses. And these conversations are started between Malachi, who's acting as God's messenger, and the people of Israel, or the priests, or whoever is being addressed, but it's kind of a conversation or dialogue that's taking place. And there are 6 of these in Malachi. We looked at the first one, then last week we started looking at the second one. And the second one starts in Malachi chapter 1, verse 6, and then it concludes in Malachi chapter 2, verse 9. And the second discourse, as you can see in chapter 1, verse 6, it says, to you priests who despise my name. So this dialogue is between God and his priests. These are the people who are supposed to be, who God has called out. They're supposed to be the spiritual leaders in Israel. They're supposed to be sanctified and holy, and they're supposed to respect God with honor and dignity in the way that they conduct themselves. And what we see and what we've looked at is that they weren't doing that. And just again, we won't read the previous section again, but just kind of glazing over chapter 1, 6 to the end. You just kind of look at the words that are used here. It says, "O priests who despise my name," in verse 6, and says in verse 7, it says, "You offer polluted food upon my altar." And then in verse 7, it also says, "The Lord's table is despised." Verse 8, it says, "You offer blind animals in sacrifice." Verse 8 also says, "You offer those that are lame or sick." Then down to verse 12, it says, "You," talking about the Lord's table, "you profane it." Also in verse 12, it says, "The Lord's table is polluted and the food is despised." Verse 13, it says, "You bring what has been taken by violence or is lame or sick." And then verse 14, it said, "Cursed be the cheat who has a male in his flock and vows it, and yet he sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished." So as you read through the beginning of this, you get an idea of what's going on. It says that they're despising or they're profaning God's altar. And what they're doing is just the way that they're conducting these sacrifices. Instead of giving to God the best, they're bringing the worst. So that when you're sacrificing things to the Lord, you're supposed to give to him the best. But what they were doing is they would say, well, we're going to give the lame, the sick, the ones that are, this is taken by violence, things like that. These are, instead of honoring God in the way that they're doing these sacrifices, they're doing the opposite of that. They're giving like the worst. They're giving things they don't want anyway. They're blind. And so this is kind of high level. Some of the things that are being addressed in this section is just the way the priests are conducting their service. We didn't get a chance to look at it last week, but I think it is helpful just to take a minute to look in Leviticus, where the people are given directions on how they were supposed to conduct these sacrifices. If you want to turn to Leviticus chapter 2 with me for a minute. Leviticus 22. And if I could have a reader read a couple sections out of that chapter. Leviticus 22, and maybe verse 2 as a start. As a start, yeah, and then we'll look at a few others. I'm going to hang on to it.
Say, hallow unto me, I am the Lord.
Okay. Mine says that they do not profane my holy name, that they dedicate or hallow, but same idea. Their job is to hallow things or understand that what they're doing is sacred to God. And if you go down to verses 17 and really 17 to 30, just maybe 17 to 19, just 17 to 20. Let's read that just for time's sake.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say unto them, Whatever he be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers of Israel, that will offer his obligation for all his vows, and for all his freewill offerings, which they will offer unto the Lord for a burnt offering, ye shall offer at your own will a male without blemish of the beeves, of the sheep, or of the goats. But whatsoever hath blemish, that ye shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable for you.
Okay, so this idea is you're not supposed to offer things that are blemished in this. It's supposed to be, the best of what you have. But they were doing the opposite of that at this time. They were taking, animals that were, blemished, defective. They were lame. They were blind. They're things they wouldn't want anyway. And they're saying, okay, that's what we'll give to God. And so that's sort of the principle that's happening here, is that they're really not showing respect and reverence for their role as priests and to God's altar. And those are the terms that you see over and over again. It talks about God's altar being polluted and defiled and being despised. And it's really a sad situation. And this is what Malachi is addressing, is that they really need to think about what they were supposed to be doing as priests and get back on the right track. And then, you look in the history of Israel, and we talked about this a little bit, but this isn't the first time this has been an issue, right? If you go to the days of Eli, the priest Eli, he had his two sons. And you remember his two sons were infamous, and what they would do is when someone would bring an offering, what would they do? Yeah, they'd stick it in there before it was, and they grab out the fat, and not to mention, there were women serving in the temple. They were taking advantage of them. So these guys were doing the same thing. They were profaning God's house. They were showing a lack of respect. And what happened to Eli's house as a result of that? They were cut off. They eventually were, killed, and part of that happened under the leadership of Saul. As kind of he was chasing David, and but anyway, they ended up being cut off from the priesthood. And this isn't the first time this has happened, and so this is something they should have known from their history. They should have respect, but they weren't. So it's like they've come back from the exile, they're serving in the temple, and they're starting to do the very problems that got them issues in the first place. And so this is where Malachi is addressing some things. And there's one point in that we looked at where it talks about, verse 10, it says, "Oh, that someone would shut the doors so that you would not kindle fire on my altar in vain." It says, "I have no pleasure in you." It's like, you're doing such a bad job. I wish you'd just stop doing it. It's either if you're going to do this, you got to do it right, or just shut the doors, is the way that that expression comes out. I think Jesse has a comment.
So Nadab and Abihu also didn't take the fire seriously, and trying to remember the names of the people who were swallowed by the earth.
Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.
They had responsibilities and took them in the wrong direction as well. So this is something that always goes on, and I think it would be sort of a validation for why Christadelphians don't have people in positions of authority other than elected people, because the human nature tendency is to continue to do this, and it's an insidious thing within us that we get a little bit, we want more of whatever it is, the power or the food or anything.
Casey's.
Verse 8 says, by saying that the Lord's table is contemptible. That kind of struck me, because the Lord's table is not a common Old Testament phrase, I don't think. So to me, the question is, do we say, or not say, but act as though, or treat the Lord's table with contempt?
I'm not seeing that verse.
However you
8.
want to define that.
Or 7, sorry.
Verse 7, sorry.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so do we treat the Lord's table with contempt in any way, either by offering God the poorest of our days, or as presiders, not treating it with, that's as close as we're going to get today, as Jesse said. Do we treat presiding with just, oh, okay, I'll take care of that? Or do we treat it as more than that? Just an observation, that phrase, the Lord's table.
Yeah. And someone, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, someone mentioned this last week, and we can turn there. It's in 1 Corinthians 11, and it's interesting, you see what's going on in Corinth. A lot of the issues that Paul is addressing with the Corinthians, kind of similar language, like you called out here. It's the Lord's table. And let's just look back there. But yeah, I think there are definitely principles, like you mentioned, from what's happening here that should translate into, the way we respect God's table today. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and maybe, read verse 17 as a start, 11:17, if someone wants to. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 17.
Just that verse.
As a start, yeah, we'll jump on a few others.
Now this is that I declare unto you, that praise you not, that you come together, not for the better, but for the worst.
Yeah, so this is where Paul's kind of starting in, and this is how he starts leading into this conversation about what we consider the emblems. As I say, when you're coming together to do these things, it's not for good, but for worse. It's actually causing problems. And maybe look at verses 27 through 32.
So then, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink from the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. But if we were more discerning with regard to ourselves, we would not come under such judgment. Nevertheless, when we are judged in this way by the Lord, we're being disciplined so that we will not be finally condemned with the world.
Yeah, so when you look at these passages, and again, Casey just tied it in as well, is that you look at the Lord's table at this time, the bread and the wine. There's a warning: don't partake of this. And my version uses the term "in an unworthy manner," and kind of reflects what Malachi is telling the priests in his day. They're polluting God's table. They're despising it. They're profaning. He's using all these words, and then Paul warns the Corinthians about the same thing. It's like, when you're coming together, that's what you're doing right now. It's not for better, but for worse. And there needs to be a certain respect and reverence for these things, because you're not supposed to partake of these in an unworthy manner. And he uses that expression: you're guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. And so this is pretty strong language that the Apostle Paul is using. So again, you read these things in the Old Testament, like in Malachi. I think there's some clear principles that are picked up in the New Testament when we talk about things like, again, the breaking of bread. And I think Casey rightly called out, as presiders, that's something we should always have in our mind when it's our turn to do that. But Paul even makes it sound like it's really to everyone in that congregation, right? Let everyone examine themselves. And so that's a real calling for the congregation. So again, you kind of read through Malachi, and he's like going after these priests who are doing a bad job and not respecting. But there's definitely, I think, some application we can draw to now that we're in Christ as well. And we don't really necessarily have, the priesthood and the sacrifices and things like that, but some of those things apply as well. And you kind of think about, what would be maybe a modern equivalent of giving something that, instead of giving the best of their flock, they're giving the lame, the blind, and the sick. if you were to look at a modern parallel, how would you, is there any kind of lesson for us today in that? And I see a hand with Jessica.
I forgot what I was going to say now. I think we have a tendency to give God what's left over at the end of our day, or, with our leftover energy that we haven't put out at work or in whatever capacity, and trying to flip that and always be aware of that, of giving God the first fruits of our time and energy and money and everything.
Mhm. All right, so back in Malachi, just again wrapping up in what we looked at chapter 1, and there were a couple other places, like it talks about, I wish you would just shut the door instead of profaning it. And Brother Joe brought us to several passages. One of those was Amos chapter 5, where it talks about, I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Things, it's kind of the same idea. And this is a different time period, but it's the way that they were doing things. It's like they were going through these actions, but they were lacking justice in there. And that's this other thing. And it's like, you're doing all these things. You're coming in and you're offering sacrifices. You have these feasts, but you're missing the big things. And it's like, I despise these things. Don't go through that. Make sure you're keeping the important principles as well. And so kind of that same idea is here in Malachi, where it's like, I wish someone would just shut the doors rather than to kindle this fire and altar in vain. And so it's a similar idea. And talking about this idea of the incense and the altar, verse 1 of 11 kind of gives this really big picture where it says, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. In every place incense shall be offered to my name, and a pure offering for my name shall be great among the nations. And so God is saying, even though you're doing a poor job, I'm still going to be glorified. My plan's still going to come to fruition. And that's just again, a strong reminder there. So that's kind of, again, where we got that first part of this, but this discourse kind of continues in chapter 2. So if we could just read chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 2, I'm sorry, we're in Malachi, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9.
And now, O ye priests, this commandment is for you. If you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to heart, to give glory unto my name, saith the Lord of hosts, I will even send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yea, I have cursed them already, because you do not lay it to heart. Behold, I will corrupt your seed, and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your solemn feasts, and one shall take you away with it. And ye shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant might be with Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. My covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him for the fear wherewith he feared me, and was afraid before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and did turn many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth. For he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. But ye are departed out of the way. Ye have caused many to stumble at the law. Ye have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law.
Thank you for reading that. So, this continues on, and again, chapter 2 opens up with, and now you, O priests. So it's very clear that this is being directed at these priests who are being negligent in their responsibilities. And then in verse 2, it starts to come into that there's going to be consequences for what you do. It says, I will send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. And I don't know, when I start hearing about cursings and blessings, it's just, I think of like the Bible echo. That gets me back to the, before the people came into the land. Remember how God had those conversations with them? It's in Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 20. If you want to flip back there. And you look at these different chapters, and starting in verse 11, we don't have to read through this, but you just kind of glance over where Moses is commanding the people to stand and say all these different things. It says in, cursed is the one who makes a carved image in verse 15. Cursed is the one who treats his father and mother with contempt. Cursed is the, and it goes through the end of that chapter, and it's just like going through these laws, but making it very emphatic. When you're rejecting these things, it's like there's a cursing that's going to come on you. And that same thing comes up in the next chapter, chapter 28. And chapter 28, you have these, the blessings in the first part of that chapter through 14. And then starting in verse 15, you have the cursing. So again, there's this idea of you're choosing two different ways. You're choosing a God's way, which leads to blessing, or you're choosing man's ways, which leads to cursing. And again, just looking, starting in verse 15, it says, if you do not obey the voice of your God, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city. Cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall you be your basket. It just keeps using that expression over and over again. And so, when I hear the priests receiving this message, it's almost that echo seems to be there, that they're choosing the path that God warned them about, the path of cursing. And this is what they're doing. They're not respecting God's law. And he said, this cursing is going to be upon you. All these curses I talked about, that's going to be brought on your head. So it's just a kind of a stark contrast there with the way that they were behaving and the consequences that they're going to see. And as a result, you see in verse 3, it talks about, I'm sorry, Justin.
Again, so you've heard the phrase that you can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So it's never too late to screw up. And what happens, people are having a good time and they get complacent, and they also think that they can afford to do something for themselves. And then off you go, and nobody gets away with anything. So we have to constantly remind ourselves not to relax, not to be complacent, and to keep focused on doing what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then, you look at the consequence of that. Again, it goes back to what's going to happen. The punishment says, I'm going to rebuke your descendants and spread refuse on your faces. I mean, just listen to the strong language there, where it talks about these things that are going to happen to them. And, it's about, yes, I will rebuke you, your descendants, and I will spread refuse on your faces and the refuse of your solemn feast, and one will take you away with it. So there's that strong language, and you see that's used in other places too. If you want to hold a finger here and turn back to 2 Kings for a minute. Chapter 9. Kings chapter 9, and looking at verses maybe 36 and 37. 2 Kings 9, verses 36 and 37.
When they came back and told him, he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field. in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, this is Jezebel.
So very, kind of similar language, talking about a different time period, and this is during Ahab and Jezebel. And we know how bad Ahab and Jezebel were, the kinds of things that they did, the false, idols and these false priests that were the prophets of Baal, and that was the kind of language that God used through his prophet Elijah, what was going to happen. She's going to be like refuse or dung on the surface of the field. You've seen that same language now being used about these priests in the days of Malachi. That just, I don't know, to me, it really brings home just how serious this problem was, how bad things were gotten. It's the same kind of, condemnation that you see in the days of, Jezebel and Ahab. These two were probably one of the worst that we see in all these kings. And that's the same kind of condemnation that the priests in the days of Malachi are receiving, because they're behaving just as bad, but in a different way. They're not maybe offering to false idols and things like that, but what they're doing is they're showing contempt for God's altar in a different way, but equally problematic.
And in verse 3, it's very telling when he says, I will corrupt your seed. The Jewish people from the very beginning had prided themselves on their lineages. I know who my daddy is and who your grandfather is, and so forth and so on. They even said the same thing to Christ, who are you? Who's your parentage? And so God says, I'm going to make that difficult. You're going to end up interbreeding, and you're not going to have that pure line that you had before, just like the dung you've done to me. And so he did do that in dispersion, and of course, we saw later in the New Testament.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think to the Jewish culture, that probably means more than it would to our culture. We don't probably put as much emphasis on I don't know who my grandfather was 8 generations back, but people of Jewish descent, they might know that, because that's a big deal to them, like who your lineage is, and to hear that your descendants are going to be in trouble, that's a pretty strong rebuke. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, just to think about who the audience is and what that would mean to them. It's pretty strong.
In verse 2, he actually says, I will send a curse on you, and I will curse your blessings. So the things that the priests were blessing, or saying were good, are the things that God is cursing. And, in chapter 1, it was all about the weak and the lame and the blind, the poor quality sacrifices. They said, yeah, that's good. And down in verses 7, 8, 9, he says, you have not followed my ways. You have shown partiality in matters of the law. He says, and by your teaching, you have caused many to stumble. So again, the question is, for each of us, is in what way might we be teaching and promoting something that God would curse?
Mm-hmm.
Are we possibly doing that?
I think Walter answer.
One of the most beautiful things about Malachi and its prophecy, it has such echoes and reaches into the New Testament that you can see these things here. You can see the echoes of how the priest would teach the people a new corrupted law to accomplish the task they wanted, and how Christ would stand against them and say, no, this is not what my Father taught you. In fact, have you made my Father like a house of iniquity, thieves, and all that kind of things that he talked about here. And such, if you think about it, the final curse that God puts on them for the sake of his Son is when he destroys the temple, all records everything there has to do with genealogy and who you were are destroyed and lost. And the only last heir known is the Son of God.
And you're right, there certainly are a lot of echoes that you'll see picked up on in the New Testament as well. This is and I think we're, at least for me, if I look at like what I would consider maybe a key passage or a key theme in Malachi, this is all about Malachi as a messenger. And he's addressing this idea about messengers, and that's kind of what we're leading into here. Is just one of the jobs of the priest. Verse 7 is, he's a messenger of the Lord. That was his responsibility, and they really weren't doing that right now. And I think that is kind of an important topic. And if you look at Leviticus, just to kind of get a background of what God expected of the priests when he set up this priesthood, because that's what Malachi, what God does through Malachi, is he kind of talks about, I don't want to say the good old, but you have these Levites, when they originally were called out, you know, he says they were reverent before my name. Law and truth was in his mouth. And so that's what it's kind of getting back to. So if you look at Leviticus chapter 10, really where you see the calling of these priests. And Leviticus chapter 10, and let's go, if we could just read verses 8 through 11.
Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses."
And interestingly, this is just right after the fire with the Nadab and Abihu situation. It's almost like God's reiterating their point, but this is one of their jobs, is to teach the children of Israel the statutes of the Lord. So they, in many ways, they were supposed to be God's messengers through the things that they were teaching the people. So that was an important part of their job. See that again, Deuteronomy chapter 33. And verse 10, yeah, I guess just talking about Levi, maybe 8 through 10 for context. Deuteronomy 33, 8 through 10, talking about the role of the priest that God had called for them.
And of Levi he said, "Let thy Thummim and thy Urim be with thy Holy One, whom thou didst prove at Mesa, and with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah." Who said unto his father and to his mother, "I have not seen him," neither did he acknowledge his brethren, nor knew his own children, for they have observed thy word and kept thy covenant. They shall teach Jacob thy judgments, and Israel thy law. They shall put incense before thee, and whole burnt sacrifice upon thine altar.
Yeah, so again, there's that idea. Their job is to teach Jacob your commandments and Israel your law. So that's one of the key responsibilities of the priesthood, is to make sure that the people were, being sufficiently taught in how they were supposed to live. And so, if the priests were being negligent in their duty, it was kind of a trickle-down effect. It wasn't just going to be an impact on their house, but it was going to have far-reaching implications on the whole nation. And just one other passage kind of on this subject in 2 Chronicles, and this is later on where there's a reform taking place in the days of Jehoshaphat. 2 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 9.
Second Chronicles 17, verse 9. And they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with them. They went about through all the cities of Judah and taught among the people.
So just the context here is that Jehoshaphat has come on the throne. His father was not a very godly man, and he's really making all these reforms. And well, at least towards the end of his life, he's just stopped being godly. But anyway, Jehoshaphat comes in, he starts making all these reforms. And one of the ways he does this reforms is he sends out all these priests. And I just lost the very verse I was looking at, verse 9, which was just read, is that they, referring to the priests, were sent out to all these areas and they taught the people. So this is one of the responsibilities they were given, is to go out and sort of bring the people back by educating them about God's law. So again, you see this role of the priests. They were truly to be God's messengers for the people. They were supposed to bring his message, and they were supposed to do that faithfully. As we see in the days of Malachi, that just wasn't happening. And again, back in Malachi, what he tells them is that the lips of the priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth. And so again, this is one of their main responsibilities, and this is something that they're failing at.
Might be good to read 10 and 11 to show the contrast of when you turn away and when you serve. Because verse 10, and the fear of the Lord fell upon the kingdoms of the lands that were round about Judah, so that they made no war against Jehoshaphat. Also, some of the Philistines brought Jehoshaphat presents. I mean, their arch enemy. It showed there's a contrast there. When we serve God, even our enemies will be at peace with us. And that's really critical there, because it's like, well, I got to do this, but people are still going to try to kill me.
Mm-hmm.
But God can turn that around. So that's why we need to serve him in righteousness.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the blessing and cursing, which path they were choosing, and they were choosing the path of cursing. So I'm seeing the kids pop up, so I did want to take a little bit of time, and we'll touch on it next week, just to really think about, you see some of these same themes get brought up in the New Testament as well, as the responsibility of the believers, responsibility of the elders, responsibility of those that were teaching. They had the same imperative to ensure that they were faithfully keeping God's law. And we were going to look through some of those passages. You especially see it in what are called the pastoral epistles, where the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy and Titus. And Timothy and Titus were these guys that were being sent to these different ecclesias to keep up, to build on the work that Paul started. And Paul gives them this advice: here's some of the things that you need to do. And what you see is one of the common themes that Paul hits on again and again and again, is to make sure what they were teaching was in accord with sound doctrine. He just kind of hits on the importance of that subject. So God willing, next week we can maybe touch on some of those things, and then we'll move into the really the third discourse, starting in chapter 2, verse 10, where God moves on to another issue that he's addressing. So thank you.